a lot of the people whose stories are in the archive may not be famous in this traditional way, because being out at the time that they were out made their lives a lot harder and like kept them out, denied them access to certain avenues of being like wealthy and famous.
Want to listen to this episode ad-free? Head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room, and get a free trial for the ITBR professor level. And you can actually watch this episode as a video episode as well. While you're at it, did you know that on Spotify, we now have a subscription service for $10 a month? You get access to all of our ad-free episodes plus any bonus episodes. So make sure that you rate, review, and follow the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Make sure that you follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And follow Mary DePippi's show, True Crime in Academia, at True Crime in Academia. Thank you all for your support, and without further ado, here's today's episode. Before my episode with author Amelia Possanza begins, I wanted to acknowledge a really exciting accomplishment and announcement. Amelia has been nominated for a Lambda Literary Award. So her book, Lesbian Love Story, a memoir in archives, has been nominated under the category Lesbian Memoir and Biography. So congratulations are in order for Amelia. I'm so happy to hear this news. And without further ado, here's my episode and discussion all about diving into lesbian love stories. Yes, that is a reference to Adriana Rich's poem, Diving into the Wreck. I hope you all enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So I'm continuing conversations with queer female artists and queer female empowerment. So I'm really excited to bring on Amelia Possanza, who is a full-time book publicist and part-time writer. She currently lives in Brooklyn. I know that she said there's construction going on, but I don't hear anything. So it sounds very peaceful on your end, Amelia. She lives with her cat. Maybe we'll see a feline appearance soon. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, Electric Literature, The Millions, and NPR's Invisibilia. Oh, I love that show. Okay. Lesbian Love Story is her first book, and it's called Lesbian Love Story, a memoir in archives. And there's a beautiful photo of swimming, and we'll dive. Well, that was a bad pun, or a good pun, but an easy
It's hard
pun.
to resist them.
I know. So we'll dive into everything lesbian love story. Welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, Amelia.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm really just curious about, first, you being a book publicist interests me, since, like, what's the boundary between you being a full-time book publicist and you carving out the creative space? Like, was it hard to navigate during this journey of creating your first book?
A lot of this book was written during the pandemic, which I didn't end up including a lot in the book because it just didn't feel relevant to, the experiences of the historical figures I was writing about, but it was a big part of my experience. And I think I was just very lonely in my apartment, very lucky to be sort of safe and healthy, but I needed something to do. So I feel like the people, like the 7 lesbians I researched for the book, were kind of like my dead friends in a really creepy, weird way, keeping me company during the pandemic. I think that weirdly opened up a lot of extra time because I was missing queer community. I was missing going to bars like Ginger's here in Brooklyn, my favorite lesbian bar, and, like connecting with community. So this felt like an imaginary space to do that. But then also, like, in publishing, I feel like you were alluding to this a little bit. I've sat in so many rooms where people are like, discussing a book proposal, discussing a pitch. And I think in order to access a creative place, I had to have like a boundary up against, that kind of thinking, because if you're trying to sit down and write and imagining people dissecting your work, just nothing comes out. It's paralyzing.
And I feel that you might easily have that censorious or self-censoring mind of, oh, this wouldn't work well for a marketing pitch. So is that the voice you're talking about that you had to tune out in a way?
Yeah, and even like the marketing pitch and even like what would sell. Like, I've heard different people, different generations have different ideas about what sells and what people are interested in. But I think the great thing is that it's shifting all the time. And there's always something that like surprises us, that everyone was like, oh, this book or this show was just supposed to be like a little blip. And then like everyone flocked to it. Like sometimes I think about Queer Ultimatum. I was like, how did that, I don't know if you watched, but I'm like, how did that pitch go over?
So
Because
what
it's
is
like,
Queer Ultimatum,
oh,
Amelia?
you have to
No,
watch.
explain it to me. Yeah, yeah.
You
Convince
have to.
me.
It's a queer dating show that's incredibly chaotic, because the first season was with heterosexual couples, and the whole sort of conceit is that one partner has said, you have to marry me or I'm breaking up with you. And the other partner is like still on the fence after hearing that ultimatum. So then they go on the show, and then they meet everyone else on the show, and they have to pick someone else on the show to have a trial marriage with. So they move in for like 3 weeks with a total stranger. And then after those 3 weeks, they move back in with their partner for like another 3 weeks. Like it's just, and so they do this entirely with like lesbians. And I think since the show, that the idea that they're all lesbians has been complicated. I think they all were doing the she, her thing for the show. And now I follow them all on Instagram. But it was just so extremely chaotic. And I don't think that, I mean, maybe someone knew that this would really hit home with a lot of queer people, but there are so many conversations that I have with like queer people that I'm meeting for the first time, and that's like a touchstone and a point that we bond over. So I love when something kind of breaks expectations and finds a home when no one thinks it will.
Well, I'm definitely going to have to watch this because I feel that it also, do you feel that it strengthens the trope of lesbians and like wanting to settle right away and that distance between gay men and lesbians that, be like being a gay man currently in a relationship? I like the nurturing now and like that
Yeah.
homebody sense, but there's always been that division, like, oh, gay men are on the prowl and women, get the moving van right away after a week of a relationship.
Well, it's so funny that you bring that up, because like in the book, I was thinking about that trope, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I believe in that trope. Maybe that's offensive. Like we see it a lot, U-hauling. And then there's like Mabel Hampton, this woman who like met her partner in like the 30s. After like 4 weeks, they moved in together. And like she left behind all these oral history tapes, and on the oral history tapes, she's like, oh, after we got together, I didn't like going out as much. We were homebodies. And I was like, wow, this is not just a current contemporary stereotype. We've got like almost a century ago. This was what people wanted.
Yeah.
But yeah, on
Oh,
the show, oh, sorry,
no,
go
sorry. I
ahead.
was just gonna say, like, can you also mention who the 7 lesbians are that you're working
Yeah.
with?
Wow, it feels like a test. Okay, let's see if I can remember. One, Mary Casal, who sort of straddled the turn of the century, Mabel Hampton, um, and then Rusty Brown, Babe Diedrichson, Gloria Anzaldua, Amy Hoffman. Oh my gosh, I feel like I missed. Oh, and I think I snuck in Sappho
Yes,
in a
yes.
more sort of fictional way. I think with the other folks, I was really focused on the historical record, and I was like, we don't really know anything about Sappho, so I can just like lead into the mythos a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and you even do start with your LGBTQ swim team that you were one of the only women and one of the gay men on the team, he couldn't believe that you had a sexuality. I found that really invigorating of like that he couldn't process that women had a sexuality. Like what was, why did you include that as your opening, but also what was going on there in your opinion?
Well, it's funny. I feel bad for having sort of roasted this person so hard, because it's someone that I care about deeply. I only roast the people that I care about deeply. But I think I also picked that moment because he wasn't the only one on the swim team that had a reaction like that. Someone else, that we were talking earlier about how I went to Swarthmore, and someone made up this whole story about my life that he told me. He was like, oh, I bet you were one of those girls who went to Swarthmore and dated the men on the lacrosse team and went to Bryn Mawr, which is like a nearby women's college, to sort of like experiment with women and blah, 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 and he just kept telling me this story, and eventually I had to be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I would like to get a word in edgewise and tell you the truth about my story. I think there's such an old trope, like we see it in Sex and the City, and other media of like the gay man with the straight female best friend. And I think like, I don't know if the trope is leading people in real life or the trope is representing people in real life, but it definitely seems like there's more of like an assumed affinity or bond there, and not sort of the same, like, I think all queer people are put under the same umbrella, whether they're trans or bi or ace. And then I think sometimes that inevitably leads to like, oh, we aren't all the same. There's a lot of diversity within that umbrella.
Well, and you going to Swarthmore, which is one of like the top liberal arts colleges, or I was even saying to Amelia, I grew up in South Jersey, so like I know Swarthmore, I know Bryn Mawr,
Yeah.
and I feel that Philly intellectual creative vacuum is so fascinating because it's not representative really of anything outside of those colleges. Like they are um, very bubble spaces for thinking through the liberal arts. So I'm just curious, do you feel that your undergrad, the thinking of liberal arts colleges is usually that they're an LGBTQ plus experimental zone, like you've already mentioned, but even that you're learning all of that curriculum? Was that true? Like, did your professors really dive deep into Virginia Woolf or E.M. Forster, and you really felt like you were in that Bloomsbury melting pot, or even reading The Color Purple? Is it really that representative of LGBTQ plus culture and society, or is that not necessarily true?
Well, I went back for my 10-year anniversary a couple years ago, and a younger alum hosted this really amazing discussion group for all LGBT alums. And so there were people who were like on campus in the 80s and 70s. There were people who graduated 2 years ago. And like across all those decades, everyone had the same experience to share, which was they felt like actually, because it was such a like intellectual and political space, there wasn't a lot of room for questioning. Like everyone was like, oh, I was there, wondering like, what is my sexuality? Like, what is going on with me? And then you would go to a group on campus, and the group on campus was like, we are ready to go to this march, or, that being queer is this huge political identity, which is something I completely agree with. But I think when I was like 19, I was so intimidated by that. And there was something very cathartic about like connecting with all of these other alums that like spanned decades, and everyone was like, it actually was challenging that it was such an intellectual and political space when we were just sort of like, I want to be a kid who actually doesn't know and wants to, everyone felt like if you were going to go to like the queer student group, you had to show up and be like, this is who I am and I'm ready to attend like every march happening this year. I think we all wanted a space to be like, I need to know that this is a safe space to like say the wrong thing or like declare one identity and then have that move and shift. So I actually think the intellectualism ended up being a challenge to like the kinds of exploration that ends up being the stereotype.
Well, and in nearby public university world, like a Temple, or even a U Penn, which is an Ivy, but that I went to a state university, and
Yeah.
I feel that there were always challenges to the material that we were even reading from the faculty. So like even when we were reading The Color Purple, there was
Yeah.
actually it was Possessing the Secret of Joy by Alice Walker, which I really love. That there were even students like challenging the queerness in the book, like in
Wow.
terms of politicization. And I
Yeah.
actually found it like in the moment frustrating, but then now reflecting back, it was actually really important to be in my human sexuality course and people challenge LGBTQ identity because it had me frame my debating style and like, well, how am I going to approach people of differing political views? When you get those different
Yeah.
political views in a state university where I feel like in a Swarthmore, if you're a conservative person,
Oh,
you're going to
yeah.
be a pariah.
And I think some people, even I worked for the student newspaper, and some people with more conservative perspectives wrote op-eds, not about their conservative beliefs, but about the fact that they felt shunned for even having those beliefs, and that people didn't want to, even engage or hear their perspective.
And you might become like a Meghan McCain. Like I know Meghan McCain went to Columbia, but I feel that maybe sometimes I think we've hit something, Amelia, which is maybe sometimes when you're in a really progressive college and you are more conservative, you could become more radicalized, like an Ann Coulter, even that you kind of get
Yeah.
a shtick because you constantly think that you're under attack, even though that's not true in reality.
Yeah, you're in such a the sample size is not reflective of the nation as a whole. It
Yeah.
was definitely a bubble.
Yeah. But well, so you got out of Swarthmore and now you're in Brooklyn. So maybe that gay male teammate saw you as if you were in a girl's narrative arc.
Yeah. I
He's
think
like,
definitely being like, oh, one of these millennial women, what's she up to? Broad City.
mm-hmm. Yes, yes. But how did you end up in New York City? Like, what happened to go from Swarthmore? Was your path always, oh, I'm going to go hit the ground running and go into the publishing industry, and that has to happen in New York City? A special thank you to the April Virtual Book Club members. We read Wicked by Gregory Maguire, and I'm going to be releasing that book club episode soon on our Patreon because if you're a Patreon member, you actually can listen back to our book club discussions, which is really exciting. And thank you to the book club members for allowing that to happen. So, for May, I actually have a poll up right now on ivorytowerboilerroom.com. Scroll down to events and you'll see that neck and neck, it really is neck and neck. Right now, the two books are either The Book of Gothel by Mary McMinn, which is a retelling of Rapunzel, but from Gothel, Mother Gothel's viewpoint, who's seen as a villain, similar to Alphaba and Wicked, or we're going to read Blonde by Joyce Carol Oates, which fictionalizes Marilyn Monroe's life and is what the Netflix film was based on. So please get your votes in as soon as possible, and I'll announce the winner on May 1st. But again, it's not necessarily a winner because I think we're going to read the other book in June since it is so close. And it's such a heated contest for which book we're going to read. And also, you can put in a book that you recommend for us to read, and I'm definitely going to take that into account. Let's just say we might be reading The Great Gatsby this summer because I think we're going to see it on Broadway. Spring has sprung here on Long Island, and I'm excited to talk about the Soapbox NY, a bath and body boutique located in historic Port Jefferson Village. My good friend Janine Cucci co-owns the Soapbox NY. Not only has she been on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast, but she's also been on my good friend Christian Garcia's podcast. So she gave me a special spring scent from her blending bar. You might ask, Andrew, what is the blending bar? Well, it's what makes the Soapbox NY so unique, in my opinion. They have over 200 essential oils that can be made into shower gel, bubble baths, shampoo, body lotion, an essential oil roller, or even perfume. So, the first scent that I want to highlight is called Peony Blush Suede, an exquisite floral with delicate rose and honey accents and a subtle green freshness. The second is Mimosa and Tonka with notes of sweet golden mimosa mixed with creamy tonka bean. And the third is Spring Musk, green and fresh with notes of bergamot, orange blossom, and neroli, a clean and fresh musk. So head over to soapboxny.com to place your order. Make sure you follow the Soapbox NY on Instagram, where you also could DM Janine with any questions. And make sure you tell her that Andrew from Ivory Tower Boiler Room sent you.
Yeah, partially because of the publishing industry and partially because I've had family here my whole
Okay.
life. And I think I idealized a lot of the city, coming to visit them and being like, oh, all of New York City is this idyllic life that when you've like been here since the 70s and own your apartment and like bought it in the 70s on the Upper West Side is really different than like I moved to Brooklyn and I work in publishing and there are cockroaches all over my
Yeah,
apartment.
you're writing in a cockroach infested apartment. But I'm
I
just
have
curious.
since
Yeah.
left the
You've left it.
cockroach,
Okay, so you've
you
left
know,
it.
just
That's good.
I've left the cockroaches behind.
I was worried for you because I'm assuming you weren't even taking baths or because that's one of my luxuries is reading with my bubble bath and like my
Oh,
apartment, has such a nice, bathroom. And I know in New York City, people will always say they don't even want to take a bath in their bathtubs
okay.
because
I've never been a bath person. Like, I'm like, if I'm going to be in
yeah.
a body of water, I want to be moving and swimming, and to just like sit there, I don't know. I can't do it.
So you're not a spa person either, then I'm assuming. Like going into
No,
hot tubs and no. Oh, see, that's
I'd
like
rather
my
just be like
luxury.
frolicking in the ocean and riding waves and getting pummeled.
Well, maybe I'll convince you. Bubble baths are one of the best detox, like just for your pores and like you put a nice face mask, put the under eye patches on. There's a whole routine.
You have like a special tray to put your book on so it doesn't fall in.
I don't actually, I do have it. You reminded me, it's under my bed,
So
where I
you
keep
don't
all
use
my
it.
storage. So
Yeah.
I'm not using it currently, but I'll like put everything because I feel that it's cumbersome to put the tray in. I like to just put it like next to me, like on the ground. I'll put all my coterie of items. But I am curious. So I'm assuming that because of your last name, I mean, right, you know what they say about making assumptions. Um, but do you
About,
come from like
about someone's
Italian? Are
sexuality.
they? Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh no,
Um,
I was thinking about, like my experience with my teammates was very much one of people making assumptions.
yeah, but do you come from New York Italian immigrants?
I am Italian on my dad's side, and they're actually in like northeastern PA, like outside of Scranton, and a lot of like
Okay.
the factory and mining towns. So the New York side is actually my mom's side, which is like a hodgepodge of Eastern European and German and Jewish.
Yeah. Well, because you mentioned the Upper West Side, and I automatically thought of the Jewish community of
Oh
Eastern
yeah,
Europe. So,
that's
but I don't
that.
like to assume.
That's where they ended up. Yeah.
Yeah, and then your father's side is more like the Delaware Water Gap, Poconos ish. Um, yeah, like you said, Allentown, Scranton, Reading. Okay, so that's my PA geography
This
for
is my
everyone.
own sort of, yeah, my own personal archive, my own lesbian history of one.
Yeah, so even with your family, how because your book is so fascinating, Amelia, since it is almost that autobiography meets, right? It's a memoir, but it's also like auto theory. You're getting at the chronology of lesbianism and like trying to find yourself, but also through the figures in the archive. Like with your own family, what did they think when you talked about, oh, this is my journey? Like, this is what I'm going to do during the pandemic, is I'm going to trace lesbianism throughout history.
Well, I'm a Scorpio. So I was actually deeply, deeply secretive about this until someone agreed to publish this book. And then I called my family and I was like, hey, I wrote a book and someone's going to publish it. And they were like, what? So I think I had to sort of keep it to myself. But then I did really involve my dad in the chapter about Sappho because one of the ways that he was able to like leave Scranton and be the first generation in his family to go to college was because he studied classics, Latin, Greek, Roman history, and he was like a Catholic schoolboy. And I think back then there were so many scholarships in the classics, which is not a thing so
Mm.
much anymore. I think he's very sad to see sort of the rise of novels that are reimagining a lot of classical characters and figures, but that's not always matched by the university study of these figures.
Mhm.
Um, but long story short, I had to sort of enlist his help in like talking about Sappho, and we did some translations of her poetry together. We did some original translations of her poetry for the book, and just sort of, I think he was mad that when he tried to teach me ancient Greek when I was little, I had no interest, but hopefully he was glad that I sort of came back around later than he had anticipated. But I think sort of my heritage played out in that way, the sort of academic heritage.
Well, that's what I was going to say is your book, it's a popular press, right? Which is what I love because, it's available at public libraries. Your audiobook is incredible. I was just listening to it and
Oh.
you actually recorded yourself performing, and I always love hearing from the author. So, um, do you see this book as scholarship?
I think that's always like what I wanted to be. Like when I was growing up, I was like, I'm going to be a scholar. And I watched, there was this PBS show, The History Detectives. It was on for 12 seasons, and I have found very few other people who have seen it. Have you seen it?
No.
I feel like everyone knows Antiques Roadshow, but this didn't
Yes.
get quite the same love, where it was three different people. One was a scholar, I think from UPenn, to Kufu Zubiri. One was like a art appraiser, and one was like an anthropologist. And people would write in with questions like, this watch that was handed down from my great grandfather, and he said it belonged to Mark Twain. Like, can you go figure that out? And then you'd like watch these people like sit in libraries and like read old newspapers and go through journals and like look at houses, and kind of along the way they would like reconstruct the story of Mark Twain's life. And usually the answer was something along the lines of like, well, it was made in the right time period, and like he would have owned a watch, so it could have been his, but we can't find anything linking it to him. And I really think I grew up being like, this is a career, and my goal is to be a host of this show. I think I was very disappointed to then like graduate from college and be like, wow, that's not really a career that I can have. I need to do something else. And I actually love that you asked about being a publicist, because part of being a publicist that I really love is sort of like the care work of helping other people tell their stories. Like someone could have a really incredible story and they've written like a beautiful book about it, but maybe not know how to find the right readers, or they might not even know what the most interesting thing about their story is. And I think I do feel really like I enjoy the work of making those connections. So I feel like that's like the only part of that show that I was able to carry into real life. So long story short, I feel like this is sort of me alone realizing my dream of pretending to be a scholar on the history detectives, the queer history detectives.
But you are a public intellect, and like me, even, my like business and my podcast is all
Yeah.
about public scholarship. So what I love though is that, you know, catapult, right? I want to make sure I get, especially with a publicist, to get the publisher right. But that they did bring out this type of almost a room of one's own, Virginia Woolf style journey back into the archives. And I mean, also your book fits in line with Zora Neale Hurston's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which is what leads Alice Walker to find Zora Neale Hurston's gravestone. And as your episode is coming out, The Color Purple is in movie theaters, which I
I really
cannot
want to.
wait to see. Yeah, I'm
I have
so excited.
something very wild to say about that trailer, which is
Yeah.
I feel like I saw one version of it before the Barbie movie where it very much seemed like a romantic love story.
Mm.
And then by the time I went to go see the Taylor Swift Eras Tour
Oh,
movie,
yeah, yeah.
they had re-edited the trailer, so it
Mm.
no longer seemed like it was romantic between
Mm.
two women. And I was like, oh, am I just bringing, this is the lens that I see a lot of things through, and maybe it wasn't that, but I was like, oh, did other people feel like this seemed
Mm.
too romantic?
Wait, did you see the first trailer in a movie theater or you saw it on YouTube?
In a movie theater, yeah.
What was the movie for
I
the
think it was
first
before
trailer?
I think it was before Barbie.
Oh, well you know what though? They do that with every movie has a few trailers. And I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about because the first trailer, I'm pretty sure, really showed Steely and Shug, like Shug arriving in the river And there was really that romantic connection. And you're right. The second one was more, I think, about the abuse of the
Sis.
husband
What I
or
also feel like,
sisters. Yeah.
yeah, I feel like the word like sister kind of kept getting repeated in that one.
But that could have also been right. Barbie has more of that feminist angle. And
Yeah.
then Taylor Swift is more about children being in the office.
Sisterhood. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how the marketing schemes work. But like, I'm not sure. Do you know Invisible Archives by Margaret Galvin?
No, I don't.
Okay,
Is it a new book, an old book?
it's new. So I literally, when your episode is coming out, I just had Margaret's episode premiere. And the reason is because her book is done by University of Minnesota Press, and it's all about queer and feminist visual culture and grassroots protesting. So,
I need
like,
this book.
yeah, so your books work in tandem. And what I find so interesting is that both of your books use the word archive, and it's part of like centering. The archive is always something that you're doing when you're telling a story, but to actually center it in your title is fascinating. So, like, I'm just curious, what was it like to go to so many archives to trace these 7 plus, women that you're calling lesbians throughout your study?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just such a nerd and sucker for archives. I think in part because of, watching the History Detectives, but in part, like in the course of researching the book, Sherry Moraga, who sort of partnered with Gloria Anzaldua to put out this bridge called My Back, she had this quote sort of for a reprint of this bridge called My Back, saying sort of like, we need historical memory because otherwise we're just, reinventing the wheel.
Mm.
And I think about that all the time because I think there are so many struggles happening in the world today that are not new, but also like have not been resolved. And, to say sort of the least politically polarizing one, like climate change. We had Rachel Carson warning us about the damage that we were doing to the environment decades ago. And that quote really still sticks with me because like as a queer person, I think I'm always searching for community, like here at Brooklyn or at Swarthmore, like contemporaries. But I also think I've always had this longing for like a lineage and ancestry and like, where did I come from? That's not, my parents and Scranton and, ancient Greek, but it's sort of like, oh, who were the queer people who came before me? And I feel like archives are just like such wonderful, like repositories for that information. And I love so much that they are often open to anyone. Like, I think that when I started this process, I was like, okay, I'm going to need to get like an official form signed that says that I have a book contract, so I'm allowed in there. And no one cared. Like the New York Public Library's philosophy is that everything is just supposed to be open to the public. And I think they, ask for personal details so that if I, spilled my coffee all
Mhm.
over, the letters that I'm looking at, they would know where to find me. But I think sometimes I'm just like, oh, there is all this information out there and sort of people who have done the work and are trying to like lead us in different directions. And if I'm disconnected from that, I'm just trying to sort of start from scratch again, like finding Mabel Hampton being like, oh, Lillian, come move in with me. We've only known each other 4 weeks, sort of like knowing that this is a trope that's almost like a century old of U-hauling. It just feels really special. So yeah, I could talk about archives all day. And I feel like part of the project, I was like, I just want everyone to go use them more. Even if you're not researching lesbians or queer people, like there are just so many resources and like stories waiting to be found.
Yeah, well, and someone that I had the experience of getting to know at Stony Brook, she was in the PhD Women's Gender Sexuality program, is Rachel Corman, who has worked a lot. Oh,
Yeah,
you know Rachel. Okay. So she's
we
worked a
just
lot at the
talked on
lesbian.
Tuesday.
Really? Okay. So the Her Story Archives in Brooklyn, which I've
Yeah,
gotten to see and is so beautifully curated. And like there's the Leslie Lohman LGBTQ Museum, which is free that I like
yeah.
recommend to everyone in Soho. But like what is it about, say, the Lesbian Her Story Archives or like a very um, grassroots place, not pitting it against New York Public Library or the Morgan Library, which I love the Morgan Library's archive. But what is it to actually get to know the people behind the scenes?
Yeah. Well, I got one of my favorite parts of writing the book was I got to talk to Joan Nessel, who is one of like the co-founders of the Lesbian Her Story Archives. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary next year.
Wow.
back in the 70s, and she lives in Australia now, and we like talked over Zoom, and I felt like I was going to cry the whole time. She was like asking me about my cat. She introduced me to her partner. Like it was very like, I don't know, it felt like we knew each other or were part of the same community, even on different sides of the world. But the thing that she said in that conversation that I can't stop thinking about it is she was like, we made the archives to break the idea of fame. And I love that so much, because I think like in history class, or even the history detective example of like Mark Twain, you know, the stories that get repeated are often the stories of famous people. And like the reasons people get famous are often really like harmful, or you know, they're generals in a war, they're presidents, you know, their battles. These are the kind of stories that keep getting repeated. And you know, to use your example of like the New York Public Library, if I went to the New York Public Library and I was like, do you want my collection of, you know, whatever it might, of here's like lesbian ephemera that I found about these people in the course of my research, would you like it? You know, I haven't asked, I don't know what they'd say, but my assumption is that they wouldn't be sort of famous enough to enter the archive. And I love the idea of a place where stories of people who may not have been famous for traditional reasons can live on, because I think that there's so much to learn from them. Like if I'm only learning from stories of people who are famous, there's all this other kind of, I think, you know, community organizing and mutual aid that I don't get to learn about. And the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I just it's
No,
so
keep
near,
going,
dear to
please.
my heart. That like I also just love that. Oh no, now I lost my train of thought. Oh well, it'll come back to me. But yeah,
Hopefully it comes back.
I love that it's
You were
not.
so excited. The
I was I
enthusiasm
just
was
love,
just overtaking you. It's an
yeah,
adrenaline rush. Yeah, yeah.
I just love that it's like about people. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I think that sometimes there's like a vein in queer scholarship that's sort of proving, in air quotes, that someone who is very famous was queer. Like Eleanor Roosevelt or Emily Dickinson are kind of ones that come up over and over again. And I think what's hard for me about that is that like often fame is a thing that like keeps people in the closet, or even just like for me personally, I'm like, it kind of doesn't matter, because what I'm looking for is sort of like examples and role models of living a queer life. And if they weren't able to be out for whatever reason, like that might not be what they're providing. So a lot, you know, a lot of the people whose stories are in the archive may not be famous in this traditional way, because being out at the time that they were out made their lives a lot harder, and like kept them out, you know, denied them access to certain avenues of being like wealthy and famous.
Sorry for the interruption, but this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I have to talk to you all about the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Yes, you might be saying, but wait, aren't I listening to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room? You are. You're listening to the podcast. But when I'm not here in the podcast space, I'm actually consulting. So I have small businesses that I help consult with their social media marketing plan. I help fellow podcasters or those who are looking to go into podcasting. And I've also just met with a client, and I can't wait for her podcast to come out. So I've also helped those in the college admission process with their essay editing. I helped someone on her thesis and actually edited and helped consult her all the way through her thesis. I'll help you with your dissertation, since I just got done my dissertation last summer. So you can reach out to me at ivorytowerboilerroom@gmail.com. Yes, I monitor my email every day. My first hour consultation is done virtually usually, and it's $30 for the first hour, and then we'll figure out what plan will work for you. So again, you can reach out to me via email, or you can also look me up on Google, Ivory Tower Boiler Room. You'll see my cell phone number there. Please do feel free to call me or DM me on Ivory Tower Boiler Room's Instagram. Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I'm really excited to talk to you all about one of our ITBR sponsors, Broadview Press. Broadview Press is an independent academic publisher in the humanities that produces high-quality, pedagogically useful books for use in university and college classrooms. They publish mainly in English studies, writing, philosophy, and history. They are always publishing with an eye towards diversity, building a strong list of titles from women, people of color, and authors from other marginalized groups. If you haven't heard my Broadview Press interviews, you need to. Recently, I just had on Dr. Shannon Day, who talked about her book, Beyond the Binary, Thinking About Sex and Gender. And in the summer, I had on Dr. Jason Holt, who gave us all a comprehensive history of what it means to be a philosopher who studies sporting culture. And of course, we went back to ancient Greek literature, mythology, history to look at the roots of athleticism. And last year, I had on Dr. Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock, who's actually going to be coming on the podcast soon to give his thoughts on the new Fall of the House of Usher Netflix series. He talked all about pop culture for beginners. And Broadview Press is offering an exclusive discount because of our sponsorship. So head to broadviewpress.com where you're going to see such a wide range of literature. Use the code Ivory Tower, IVORYTOWER for 20% off site-wide all of their books. Again, it's broadviewpress.com. Enjoy your reading. You've heard me gush over my friend Christian Garcia's podcast called That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Yes, Christian Garcia, who hosts the Smash Rewatch podcast series with me. Remember Smash, where they're putting on a Marilyn Monroe Broadway musical called Bombshell? Well, make sure you listen to our podcast series. His podcast is called That Old Gay Classic Cinema, and it is definitely meant for all of those Turner Classic Movie lovers. So he looks at classic films with a queer lens. So think of him as a queer cinema professor of sorts. He actually had on co-owner of the Soapbox NY, Janine Cucci, to talk about Sunset Boulevard, which the three of us are just obsessed with Sunset Boulevard, and we can't wait for Nicole Scherzinger to be in the revival of Sunset Boulevard on Broadway. He also has episodes about Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Strangers on a Train. Now that definitely is a queer homoerotic film. The Philadelphia Story, Meet Me in St. Louis, Beauty and the Beast, Sweet Charity, Psycho, Mary Poppins, Hello Dolly, The Wizard of Oz, Vertigo, which I actually was on, and 101 Dalmatians, and the list can go on and on and on. So make sure that you listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema wherever you get podcasts, like Spotify or Apple. Follow Christian on Instagram at That Old Gay Classic Cinema, and he also has a TikTok. And please make sure that you reach out to him and let him know that you heard this ad on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Happy podcast listening. Well, that's my frustration too. Like having just done a dissertation on Whitman, I am so invested in queering poetics and queering narratives.
Yeah.
And I do an anti-biographical approach, which is instead of like looking in the biography, let's just take their text. Like, let's take A Leaves
Yeah.
of Grass. Let's take The Fall of the House of Usher by Poe. Like, but there are a lot of scholars who are still stuck in this model of, but is Edgar Allan Poe gay? And I'm like, that's not the
Who
point
slept with
here.
who
Yeah,
hundreds of years ago?
but it's like even doing this Queer as Folk show, which I'm convincing Amelia to come on eventually, which will be great. But that there's always that question of, oh, there were half of the cast um were not queer, and they were always asked in interviews in the early 2000s, so you're straight, what's it like being a gay character? And I just find it such a useless conversation starter, because isn't it what's important is the narrative that is being shown? What's important is the fantasy of the characters. Like that's how I feel about your journey. Even with Sappho, it's a mythos. Like there's not,
Yeah.
the historical record's not there, but you get these poems. And isn't that more fascinating? Or the queerness in the Odyssey with Circe even. Isn't that more of why we turn to art and culture instead of proving an author's biography? I just find that a boring. from
Yeah.
it. I mean, it's important that they were outed to propel queer studies. Like, I don't want to discount that because I couldn't really make this claim without that scholarship. But, what was it like for you to even use the word lesbian in a type of anachronistic, like that wasn't really a word that exists in a concept, but it helps propel your narrative?
Yeah. What was so interesting, because in the course of writing the book, I think sapphic really took off in a way that I love, like especially in publishing, people are always talking about marketing like sapphic romances, and like I love that it's all going back to Sappho herself. I love that people use that word to try and be inclusive. A bisexual woman can participate in a sapphic romance. Like I really love that. But I did try and stick to the language that people use. And I was actually surprised that most of the people in the book did encounter the word lesbian at some point in their life. So even Mary Casal, after Sappho, sort of the earliest lesbian to have lived in the book, she wrote her own memoir, and she wrote it because these two sort of pseudoscientists, sexologists, hired her to do it. And she wrote it for them. We don't have the original manuscript. I mean, speaking of mythos, I'm like, I want to get my hands on that. What did it say? But there are letters between these two men, and they do kind of insult it. And one of the things that they say is they're like, the lesbian manuscript has arrived, and they're like, and it's kind of rough in places, which makes me feel very defensive of her. But I think that with her, it was like, oh, she was hired to write a lesbian memoir, autobiography, kind of testimonial. So I did try and focus on people that used that word in some way in their lives. I think dyke was really common for a lot of them, especially like, and I think in Mabel's time, she was part of a Black lesbian community, and there were sort of studs was, I think a word that is often used today. I actually think that there's another reality show that I haven't watched yet called Hoochie Daddies, which is a lot of like Black queer couples, and a lot of people who self-identify as studs. Have not watched it. Love the trailer. It just seems like people yelling at each other the entire time, which is like, a lot of reality shows. So yeah, I was very, very interested in language, and it's hard to predict too, like where the language is going to go, because I think the language is also reflective of the changes in how we understand sexuality. Like a lot, for like, I want to say like the first half, more than the first half of the 20th century, people thought of sexuality and gender as the same thing, like any sort of quote unquote woman who seemed masculine was a lesbian, regardless of like, whether that person identified as a man, identified as a woman and a lesbian, identified as like a straight woman who just happened. Like, have you seen But I'm a Cheerleader?
Oh my God. That's one of my favorite campy queer films I mean, that's when I found out the brilliance of Natasha Lyonne.
Yes. What I love that major spoiler, I love that at the end of the film, I think her name is Jan, and she like plays softball, and she kind of has like a little bit of a mustache and short hair. And at the end, she's just like, I love dick. Like, why did you put me in this conversion center? Like, just because I kind of tick off these stereotypical boxes doesn't mean that I'm like identify as a man or am a lesbian. And, those nuances just, I think, only just started to be written about fairly recently, like, the 80s and later, in really serious academic ways. So that was part of it too. I think there's one person who, looking back, used the word lesbian and dyke, in the sort of recordings. She recorded these oral history interviews. But I wouldn't be surprised if this person actually identified as a trans man, if like they were alive today, had different options available to them. And I think it's like a different sort of project that's like also really wonderful to go and claim those folks. But I think my project was much more about like, what did this word mean? What has it meant? And how has it evolved? Rather than sort of trying to get to the truth of someone's identity like in spite of what they're saying.
Yeah. Well, and was it the L word was like the counter to Queer as Folk, but wasn't there also a show recently called Lipstick Lesbians? I thought,
Ooh, I might have missed that one.
oh no,
I
or I'm making it up, but I do think there was some I'll have to look it up.
Well,
But
just
I'm
to
just
plug
curious.
my favorite lesbian show,
Yes.
there was a show on Stars that only lasted 2 seasons called Vita, about two sisters who came from LA and their mom died and they both come home and, back to their neighborhood. And they learned that their mom had been living with a woman and running this lesbian bar. And they're both queer in different ways, and they end up like staying in LA and running this lesbian bar after their mom dies. And it's really hot, really fascinating. A lot of stuff about like Latinx identity, a lot of it in Spanish. And I'm just like, I want more people to watch this show. So that's my plug. That's my PSA. Vida,
Yeah.
Vida.
So actually, there's a few. There was a British TV drama called Lip Service about lesbian women,
Ooh.
and then there was um, it was called Lipstick the series in 2015 with four sexually fluid best friends living in LA who start a lipstick line. So they literally they took lipstick lesbian
Very
very
literally.
literally. Um, yeah. It would be like, having queer men start a cigarette company. Hey, maybe that's my next project.
I know. Now I'm like, I want to start a show called Chapstick Lesbians about some lesbians who start a chapstick line. Do you think I'd get sued for copyright infringement? Probably.
With chapstick, probably.
Yeah.
It is a brand. Kind of like how everyone uses Kleenex and it's actually a brand. But I am curious, you do, posit this political statement of sorts, which is that lesbian love story. That phrase is actually something that could shake and move mountains in terms of community care and how we look towards those around us. So, like, what was it, Amelia, about that phrase, or just like what you're trying to argue for um, to help change the landscape of society?
Yeah. Well, when I started this project, I was just really like a hopeless romantic. And I was sort of like, I want to find a partner. I want to do the whole U-Haul thing. Who can teach me how to do that? Maybe my lesbian ancestors. And like Mary Casal is the first one to come in the book. And she had this like 15-year romance with a woman named Juno. And I was like, okay, great. Every single story is going to be this really strong romance. And like, it's going to be sexy. And people are going to be like tucking curls of hair behind each other's ears and this and that. And then it was the kind of thing, I don't know if this happens in your research, but like the research kind of pushed me in a different direction. Like I was coming to the table, to the archives with like these preconceptions of what it was going to be. And then I think a lot of the material that I found was so much about other kinds of love outside of romantic love. Like, even Joan Nessel, who I was quoting before, who founded the Her Story archives, there is a certain kind of like romance and love and care in the way that she's taking care of these stories. Like she was friends with Mabel Hampton, the OG U-hauler, as I like to think of her. And, I found this postcard at the Her Story archives that Joan had written to Mabel. And she's like, I'm in Switzerland. Come live here with me. I will buy a mountain for us. Right. And I'm like, what an intense gesture of romance for someone that, to my knowledge, that they were never romantic or sexual with each other. But to say like, I will buy a mountain for us, like, that's so incredible and moving. So I think that when I started to encounter these more kind of political and community-based kinds of love, it really got me thinking about, like, first of all, the narratives that keep getting repeated. They're, when you're little and you're like learning history and you're reading books, you're like, what do I want to be when I grow up? And like when I was little, the options presented to me were like, I'm a politician, I'm a president, maybe I'm a journalist, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. And I don't think I ever gave much thought to like, how am I going to take care of the people around me? What kind of community member am I going to be? Because those weren't the stories being repeated to me. Those weren't like the famous people. Like the organizers and the activists. I really want to read this book you were just holding up, Invisible Archives, because it's all about, activism, it sounds like. So I think, I started out being a hopeless romantic, and then I was like, I'm a political radical who wants us all to live, in a giant commune, even though that really failed in the 70s. And I think too, like, it started getting me thinking about how a lot of like the structures that reinforce heterosexuality also kind of tell us who we should care about. You get married, you have your children, they're inheriting your fortune. You want to buy a house for just your nuclear family. And seeing these broader networks of care I'm like, oh, it's clear how these don't align with the heterosexual project if you are just, willing to support lots of other people around you. You're not being as productive under capitalism if you're helping out people around you. So I think in the end, I was like, okay, it's great that all of these people were lesbians, but when we think about lesbians, I feel like the number one search term that comes up for lesbian on Google is lesbian porn, right? People are thinking about sexuality, and I was really excited to discover this sort of like other aspect of lesbian community and identity that went through all these different stories across the decades.
Yeah, well, and the capitalist system is a real straight male fantasy, in my opinion. That, these words are my own, not Amelia's. But like, even with my work, I came to this, like you said, your archive and your subject leads you to an argument. And
Yeah.
for me, it was this idea of a queer male procreative lineage. Like, it's so interesting. I think the pandemic really opened up the studies of intergenerational work because of us having a pause and like taking time to look back and feel nostalgic. And I think that that's really important because there is something so powerful about these generations speaking to us and helping form identity categories that can work outside of capitalism and is actually something that, we need to be in community more. So I do think the work that you're doing in Lesbian Love Story is an activist work. It is something that speaks
Yeah.
intergenerationally, and we need, like, what's wrong with seeing that as it is productive. It is part of our community-based political system that we are going to need to look more to because um, we can't be in it for ourselves in the midst of immense climate
Yeah.
emergencies and just economic emergencies.
Yeah. And, thinking about the fact that these sort of 7 people kind of like lived lesbian lives, not, closeted, famous, maybe lesbian lives, but they took big risks. And in order to take those big risks, they kind of had to like live outside the normal script of capitalism, because for so long, the script for women or AFAB people was that you had to have a husband to have an income. And these people had to find like, ways to generate their own income. Like, Mabel Hampton talks about working her whole life up until when she died. And her partner, Lillian, was a presser and was like, ironing clothes. And some of the things that I think she inhaled during that work led to like a really severe illness later in life, and took her life before Mabel died. And so there is such a strong tie to capitalism with these stories of like, how can we have, mutual aid in our community, or, who else can we invite into our home? How can we live without the money from a husband, especially like, and like, that's why sort of World War II was such a huge moment for lesbian bars and lesbian communities, because working class women who like couldn't afford to go to college and become like a secretary could go work for the war effort and make their own money. So it was also sort of unexpected, and a direction that the research led me to think about how, like how deeply queer women, queer AFAB people are sort of tied to the structures of capitalism or shut out by them.
Yeah.
And
Just because I'm naive and don't know, what does AFAB mean? Just because I'm sure there's people
oh,
out there.
assigned female at birth.
Okay,
Because
okay.
I think that also I really struggled during the writing of this book about sort of how to make it inclusive, because I think that the lesbians predominantly of the 70s left us with this very exclusive idea of who can be a lesbian. Like people were founding communes where they're like, you have to be a cis woman, and we're going to sort of check under your pants to find out to join our commune, and you need to not speak to a man. So if you're like bisexual and that's part of your queerness, like good luck, please go somewhere else. And I think that that was kind of the definition of lesbian that I inherited. And it was so interesting to me that like before then the word had much more expansive, it was being assigned to people who dressed up as men for a number of reasons. So I think I did really struggle during the writing of the book, and I continue to think about like, how can I talk about these identities in as inclusive a way as possible when people in the 20s didn't have access to all the language and identity categories that we do now.
Are you looking for a new magazine to read where you can get so many book, film, and TV recommendations? Well, then you need to check out the Gay and Lesbian Review. The G&LR is a bi-monthly magazine of history, culture, and politics that publishes essays in a wide range of disciplines, as well as a slew of reviews of books, plays, and movies, and a number of special features. Each issue brings you consistently intelligent, lively, thought-provoking articles focused on a unifying theme. So, for example, their new issue for May and June is called The Celluloid Fishbowl. And it's a nod to Vito Russo's 1981 book called The Celluloid Closet, which documented the flashes of LGBT content in movies before Stonewall when such content was strictly forbidden. So there's so many exciting articles in the May and June issue, including one by Andrew White called Queer Ghosts on Oscar Night that covers so many different LGBTQ films, both when the characters come out of the closet and what happens when characters are already openly queer and they don't need to come out of the closet, like we're seeing with so much of TV and film and literature right now. There's also an article by Andrew Holleran, the acclaimed writer of Dancer from the Dance, who actually reviews All of Us Strangers, which I can't wait to watch and has been much talked about. So please make sure that you use the Ivory Tower Boiler Room code ITBR50 when you go on glreview.org. You'll see on the right side it says subscribe. You can either subscribe for their digital edition, or if you're like me, I like to still get the magazine delivered as a print magazine. There's nothing just like having a print magazine in front of you. So use ITBR50 to get 50% off of your G&LR subscription. Yes, that's 50% off. So enjoy your reading. And please, if you are subscribing to the Gay and Lesbian Review, and if there's an article you really enjoyed, or a review you really liked, or a guest that you really want me to interview from the Gay and Lesbian Review, make sure that you DM me at Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Happy reading, everyone. And thank you to the Gay and Lesbian Review for their sponsorship. You've all heard me gush about Mandy Made It. Mandy Made It is a craft business, and it's actually owned by my friend Mandy Bengal, who I have known, married to Pippi has known. We all actually became best friends in Main Stage Center for the Arts summer theater camp. So I'm so proud of Mandy. First, she has an arts festival coming up on April 28th. It's called the Gloucester Township Arts Market and Green Fair. There are going to be art vendors, craft vendors, including Mandy, food trucks. It sounds so much fun. I actually am thinking maybe I'm going to attend. So it's in South Jersey, and it's April 28th, a Sunday from 10 to 3 p.m. So go over to at Mandy Made It to find out more information about how you can attend the festival. And please, if you see Mandy, say, oh, I listen to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, and that's how I know about your crochet company. So she makes so many wonderful items, especially because we're in the spring into summer. I know that she makes beautiful spring flowers that she crochets. She's made wonderful Pokemon inspired items. I know that my boyfriend, he loves Pokemon Go, so this is a great item for him. I actually got my boyfriend a Mandy made it Scream Ghostface bouquet for Valentine's Day. He loved it. She makes wonderful Disney inspired items. She made me a Hocus Pocus bed and breakfast item, Snow White and the Evil Queen's poisoned apple item. I know she's made Married to Pippi so many true crime items. We're in talks right now to have her make some Ivory Tower Boiler Room crochet items. Make sure that you reach out to Mandy Made It. Let her know that you heard this ad on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. She loves knowing that you're listening to her ad on the podcast. And also, she'll give you an exclusive item at Mandy Made It on Instagram and Facebook. Yeah. Well, and it kind of reminds me of Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote this novel called Herland. And then I'm trying to remember. There's something about Amazon lesbian women from the 70s. It's coming back to me from like one of my feminist courses at Stony Brook,
Is
taught by
that
Victoria Hesford. Yeah, yeah.
is
No,
that
go
the
ahead.
author of the yellow wallpaper, Charlotte?
Yeah, that's the Herland book. Yeah. So, we're at the end, which this went by so quickly, Amelia, which is why I need you back on again, in the Queer as Folk capacity. But I do feel like one of my just a question that is like reverberating in my mind as you've been speaking is, I could like tritely say, oh, where do we go from here? But
Yeah.
I am just curious, like after you writing Lesbian Love Story, how do you see the work that you did in this process? Like, how is it reverberating or reflecting current conversations, dilemmas, just this shitstorm that is our American landscape right now
In 2023.
in 2023? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I ended up thinking a lot about sort of how identity politics function, right? The identity of being a lesbian is like in this moment useful to me to like, go on dating apps or watch Queer Ultimatum. Like I think it's personally really useful to me, but I feel like we're in a moment where I'm like, I don't know that like I feel like I'm like an attacked category and I need to go found like a lesbian separatist colony. I think I'm like, oh, how can I use what I've learned from other queer people in my life, these lesbians who came before me, to think about like, okay, who are the people who we need to have solidarity with now and stand up for? And like, where are we heading as a planet, as a country? And what kinds of like organizing needs to be done to, protect lives, keep people in their homes. And I actually have found myself like going back to Leaves of Grass, another one of my father's favorite books, in addition to, Latin poetry, because, people think of it as like an encyclopedia of democratic slogans.
Mhm.
And, going back and reading it, it is so like open and inclusive and does not look at all like the society that we built. So I have become very interested in going back and being like, what would be the principles of like, a forward looking democracy? How would we build that? I've also become fascinated by the budget and like looking at old, at the city archives, New York City budgets from 1918 and like the police budget. And like, I mean, please don't quote me on this because this is research I've only just started, but like, I feel like a huge portion of the 1918 police budget went to horses, right? Feeding the horses, reshoeing the horses,
Well, with
veterinary
Central
bills.
Park,
Yeah.
yeah, too.
And it was so funny to me of like, okay, thinking about, all that money from the city going to horses for the police force versus like what all that money is going to in terms of like arms and weaponry and training,
Mhm.
for a police force now. So I feel like one project that I've become really interested in, but have been having a hard time pulling off, is like, how would I rewrite the New York City budget? How would I take the amount of money that we have allotted the city for 2023, like look at how we spent it, and it's like, how could you reallocate that to like keep people in their homes, provide healthcare services to people, provide like free transportation to people, education. So yeah, I think I've just been taking, like, hearing all these voices from these 7 lesbians and like, what would they want the world to look like today? And what are like, it's really hard to think of concrete ways to push us in that direction because so many of our systems are so entrenched.
It's an ethics of care. It's like why when I interviewed Marianne Williamson on the show, I find her views fascinating because like she is always pushing for a spirituality of care and community. And like even if you don't necessarily agree with her political that she hasn't like worked through the system, it's just, I like thinking through that spirituality could connect to politics in some way. But I still think that we're dealing with systems of capitalism like where people like it the way it is. And like we're the majority of people really want to change, but you need the those in power to accept that change needs to happen, which doesn't make them feel comfortable anymore because they don't get to benefit and, manipulate the public in a way. So, that's a whole political, yeah.
We've solved it. We've solved it. Well, because in my mind, it's sort of like 2 strategies. It's like, there needs to be a breakdown of the system that exists, because I think we can all agree, no matter our politics, that it's not working. I think people for different reasons think that it's not working, but I think all of us are like, it's not working. It's like, okay, we need like a breakdown, a takedown, a destruction of that system. But also it's sort of like, okay, before that happens, I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow or next year. It's like, how are we going to take care of people while we're fighting for that to happen?
Exactly. Well, and you kind of have teed up. I'm having an Edith Wharton scholar, my friend Sheila Limming, come on to discuss the Gilded Age season 2. And like to talk about systems of inequity. Like people are saying we're back again in like we're back to the Gilded Age period in 2023. And I agree. It's like a very the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
But to think about the women who did carve out, like these women you look to who took so many risks and put themselves out there. If you don't know of it, my friend Dawn Delicat is the director of Pen and Brush in Chelsea, Manhattan, and it's a female empowered art gallery from the early 1900s that actually late 1800s, I'm pretty sure, from Edith Wharton's period. And that's where Edith Wharton lived. That's why I'm thinking of her, was in Chelsea. And it's very queer empowered and a female empowered art gallery space. So, so many things to see.
I know now I have my homework. I'm going to watch Queer as Folk.
Yeah. Well, when you go to Pen and Brush, let me know because it's a really beautiful space. Say, Andrew. But yeah, so everyone out there, Amelia, this has been a great conversation. I can't wait for more people to have their hands on Lesbian Love Story. There you go. A memoir in archives. And you can also listen to Amelia read a lesbian love story wherever you get audiobooks, like Audible. So thank you so much. A link to your book is in the show notes. And how can everyone follow you, Amelia, on social media?
I think I very foolishly have different handles. And now in the moment, I'm like, I'm not really on Twitter anymore, but on Instagram, I think it's A Possanza.
Okay, well, it's in our show notes. So go to our show notes, everyone. Yeah.
I'll work on that part.
But it's good. Everyone will find you. Don't worry. So thank you, Amelia.
There are very few Possanzas out there. So
there we go. Well, this has been so wonderful. And I can't wait to, have you back on this show in a different capacity.
Got to do my homework first.
Okay. Well, you'll have time. Don't worry. It'll be a long turnaround. Okay. So thanks, everyone.